The most frequently heard refrain around the proverbial water cooler at the Chinese contemporary art world, next to the lament that there are no real curators, is that there are no real art critics. This position has been widely echoed in international art circles, where every year we hear the exaltation that criticism is dead, and then a panel is very quickly thrown together, usually at some art fair, to discuss the crisis in art criticism. But while in the West people seem to lament the relevance of art criticism, inside Asia it seems it's hard-pressed to locate it in the first place. Leaving aside the question of what constitutes real for the time being, let's first consider what's at stake with regards to terminology. Are we talking about the lack of qualified individuals writing on art, or the lack of such writing to be sufficiently critical, or are we lamenting the visibility of a certain kind of discursive criticality in itself? I would wager all three. Indeed, there's a global feeling that art criticism is irrelevant, eclipsed by the activities of dealers, collectors, and curators. Within China, where the contemporary art system is still in its budding stages, infrastructure-wise, and ties to an overhyped and speculative market have driven critical thinking aground, art criticism is all but non-existent. The reasons for this are multifold, and the complaints are well rehearsed. The publishing industry is flawed and too market-driven. The education system antiquated, the Chinese language ill-equipped, and the dominating presence of the market breeds indifference and slack ethics. But these concerns only serve to mask deeper issues at hand, namely the absence of a localized discourse that fosters independent thinking and critical depth. In China as elsewhere, the unrelenting force of the market has made the situation forcing art criticism an increasingly grim one. Jerry Saltz, an art critic of New York Magazine, once famously complained, "At no time in the last 50 years has what an art critic writes had less effect on the market than now." Such a statement only partially applies to a context like China, where critical voices are simultaneously drowned out by the cacophony of hype and marketing and employed superficially as academic packaging to pop up or otherwise validate an artist's work for commercial ends. The usefulness of art criticism may always be in question, particularly in times of economic strength, but defining it poses an even more difficult challenge. Contemporary art magazines on the newsstand today in China, with English names: Art Issue, Contemporary Art, Art China, Art Map, Contemporary Art and Investment, Art and Value, World Art and High Art, present a dizzying array of verbal barrage on contemporary art, but pandering to popular demand, and therefore market interests, they can hardly constitute venues for art criticism. Sadly, a large amount of what passes as art criticism in China is based on reviewing or reporting rather than criticism. It's necessary to maintain a distinction between art exhibition reviewer and an art critic. Yet in China's current landscape, squabbling over these divisions seems a futile, if endless, exercise. Add to the mix the recent invention of the curator-critic, and such distinctions are soon obliterated. Few inside the contemporary Chinese art world would self-identify solely as an art critic. This is not only because income sources extend beyond those generated by critical writing, but because to do so implies a self-appointed position of authority and suggests a level of civic duty that's nearly impossible in China. The fact that art critic is a label more often bestowed by others rather than self-selected should immediately send up warning flags as to who is deciding what is and what isn't art on those grounds. This is just one reason why the designation gets tacked onto the end of a list of other professions and titles whenever someone deems it convenient, itself a leading indication of the loose status that it confers. During the 1980s, the so-called heyday of criticism in post-Mao China, it was art historians who doubled as art critics. The tightly bound community generated a vibrant discourse that not only valued independently held views and progressive thinking, but carried out these discussions in large public forums. Today there's virtually no discourse to be found on what does manage to qualify as thin and lacking in critical depth, or in Li Weng-choi's words, discursive density. What's more, the increased levels of self-interest at the heart of the contemporary art print publishing industry have effectively steered art writing in China away from any semblance of independently reasoned criticality towards a landscape of tedious journalistic reporting and weak, jargon-filled academic fluff. Let's be clear about this. Contemporary art in China is run by the art market. Independence from it exists only in shades of grey. Some of the most widely reputed art critics in China accept either money or artworks in exchange for their texts, or worse yet, act as brokers and dealers for artists on the side. Magazines and some forums run by art spaces or private individuals and investors feature articles and advertisements that promote their own shows and artists, and writers, in the absence of strict editorial criteria, compromise their credibility by repeatedly endorsing their own close cohort of friends, partners and associates, or else ride on the shoulders of those who need no critic. Moreover, the level of criticality and critical objectivity that comes from a truly independent position is not without its financial burdens, and given the value placed upon the wealth in Chinese society, the situation is especially challenging for those art critics who want the authority and status that comes with money, but have no compromise themselves ethically to get it. But again, these are just levels we're talking about. True financial independence and true critical objectivity is a myth. Critics can only do as good as the context they work in, considering their own personal values and what does and doesn't trigger their approval switches. And in China, the current environment is weak on infrastructure and strong on power-driven personal politics. Non-existent institutions and unbiased writing may be one issue, but more pressing is how these obstacles hinder the capacity for independent thinking that allows a discursive density to emerge. Chinese art criticism is encumbered further by the fact that it fundamentally lacks its own language and vocabulary. Critical traditions that exist in the West have no similar counterpart here, and transplanting philosophers and theorists from outside China may only inhibit efforts to develop and mature homegrown methodologies. Aside from worrying about who has the power and authority in the art scene, and I think we can agree it's certainly not art critics at the moment, I seriously wonder if anyone is worrying about the nature of art itself. Why do we make art? Is it merely a vehicle for expressing one's inner self, or to understand one's place in society? What are the ways in which we can assess or recognize its value to society? I'd claim that the real dilemma facing art criticism in China today transcends the superficial lacking within the publishing industry and the market and points to something altogether deeper. Responsibility. A question often levelled at artists, whether they know why they make art, can be equally applied to critical writing and the field of criticism. Just as art is not about making something pretty or fashionable, criticism is not just about words on the page sounding good. There exists a responsibility not only within one's social or political environment, but to art itself. Criticism also requires a responsibility to its own discourse, since the critical analysis of a work of art relies not just on descriptive analysis, but an articulation of the cultural complexities that lie behind it, and a sophisticated awareness of other artworks, theories, and ideas that precede and follow it. Art cannot exist in a vacuum without criticism, nor can criticism expect to survive upon art that is produced solely for commercial gain. Contemporary Chinese art has turned into spectacle, overly reliant on visual impact and style, and short on ruminations that reveal critical depth and substance. Excessively mediated by the market and self-interest, it's lost its way with regard to political economy and the social context of its own creation. It is the passivity induced by spectacle that is the actual problem, not the spectacle itself. We as viewers have become passive witness to the spectacle. But might we expect more of art critics, whose job it is to offer insights and analyse the relationship between life and art, to impart meaning and value through articulations that engage with broader, deeper beliefs about the nature of human individuals and societies? Do we therefore lean on their perceptions according to their character, which always sways their final comments? What is criticism, if not a way to become aware of the political, and by political I mean the way our lives are organized socially and the power relations this involves, and to take up a position on the beliefs and ideological values that surround the tension that pushes art towards life? Some young artists in China today may resolutely reject policies and ideology entering their work, but such a position is nowhere more clearly ideological than in its attempt to ignore history and politics altogether. With the recent economic downturn in the market, everyone seems to be hailing the return of art criticism. But only truly alternative models can provide a place for criticism and for discourse to emerge and exist by and for itself. Change might be in the air, but only time will tell whether these steps will translate into a true realignment of values, or more importantly, can overcome the vast intellectual abyss facing China art criticism today. These things are not easy to grasp, and they take time and have to be worked at. This is in part what criticism tries to do. It is also where a fruitful and lively engagement between art and life begins. Taken from an article written in China called Art Criticism in China Today.